story time.
The night was as dark as pitch when Jake Mitchell, a seasoned truck driver, pulled his 18-wheeler into the lonely rest stop off Route 66. He had been on the road for hours, pushing through the endless stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. His eyelids were heavy with exhaustion, and the rumbling of his truck's engine was a constant, soothing companion. But he knew he couldn't go on much longer without some rest. The rest stop was like any other. A small oasis of concrete and fluorescent lights in the midst of the desolate desert. A scattering of dimly lit trucks and a couple of cars were parked haphazardly, their drivers also seeking refuge from the endless road. Jake found a relatively empty spot and eased his massive rig into the space, the brakes hissing as he brought the truck to a halt. He killed the engine and climbed out of the cab, stretching his aching muscles. The night air was surprisingly cool for the desert, and the distant howling of the wind gave the place an eerie atmosphere. Jake had always heard rumors about Rest Stop 66 tales of ghostly apparitions and strange happenings that had plagued the area for years. He had never believed in such things, but as he looked around at the desolation and the ghostly pallor cast by the fluorescent lights, a chill ran down his spine. Shrugging off his unease, Jake grabbed his duffel bag and headed towards the rest stop building. The place was small and looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades. The flickering neon sign above the entrance read, "Open 24 hours." But the dim, buzzing interior lights gave the impression of abandonment. Inside, Jake found a small diner with a lone waitress wiping down the counter. She looked up as the door jingled with his entry, and her tired eyes brightened as she spotted a potential customer. "Evan, hun," she greeted him, her voice warm and welcoming despite the weariness etched into her features. "What can I get ya?" "Just some coffee, please," Jake replied with a weary smile. He took a seat at the counter and watched as the waitress poured him a steaming cup of the dark brew. As she slid it in front of him, she leaned in closer and spoke in a hushed tone. "Be careful out here," she warned, her eyes darting around the empty diner. "This place has a history, you know. Some say it's cursed." Jake chuckled, not wanting to appear spooked. "Cursed? I don't believe in ghosts and curses, ma'am. Just tired from the road." The waitress shrugged, but there was a glint of worry in her eyes. "Well, you'll see. A lot of folks who stop here late at night claim they've seen strange things." Before Jake could respond, the door to the diner swung open, and a disheveled man entered. His eyes were wide with panic, and he stumbled over to the counter, nearly knocking over Jake's coffee. "You gotta help me," the man exclaimed, his voice trembling. "I saw something out there, something terrible." Jake and the waitress exchanged glances, and the truck driver couldn't help but feel a shiver of unease. "What did you see?" Jake asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The man leaned in closer, as if afraid to speak too loudly. "I saw a white ghost, I swear. It was standing by my truck, just staring at me with empty eyes." Jake raised an eyebrow, thinking the man was surely out of his mind, but then he remembered the eerie feeling he'd had when he first arrived. "White ghost, huh?" Jake said, trying to sound skeptical. "You sure it wasn't just your imagination playing tricks on you?" The man looked desperate. No, I know what I saw. You've got to believe me." The waitress chimed in, her voice low and serious. "It's not the first time we've heard such stories around here. Rest Stop 66 has a reputation, you know." Jake sighed, still not convinced. He figured the man had probably been on the road too long, and had let his tired mind play tricks on him. "Look," Jake said, trying to be reassuring. "Maybe you just need some rest. Grab a cup of coffee and sit down for a bit. You'll feel better after a break." The man hesitated, but eventually nodded and took a seat at the counter. As Jake watched him sip his coffee, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any truth to the stories. Maybe there was something about this place that he didn't understand. After a while, Jake decided to head back to his truck and get some much-needed rest. He bid the waitress and the panicked man goodbye, making a mental note to keep an eye out for any white ghosts. As he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something just beyond the dim glow of the rest stop lights. He quickened his pace and climbed into the cab of his truck, locking the doors behind him. Inside the cab, Jake tried to put the strange encounter out of his mind. He reclined his seat and closed his eyes, hoping to get a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. But as he lay there in the darkness, the wind howling outside and the distant hum of the rest stop lights in his ears, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Rest Stop 66 than met the eye. And as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. Suddenly, a bone-chilling sensation crept over him. His eyes shot open, and he sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the dimly lit cab of his truck, he saw a figure, a silhouette, standing just beyond the windshield. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stared in horror at the white, transparent apparition before him. The ghostly figure seemed to be looking right at him, its body swaying as if in a breeze that wasn't there. Panic coursed through Jake's veins as he fumbled for his phone, desperate to call for help. He couldn't help but notice that the white ghost appeared sad, almost mournful. It didn't move closer or threaten him in any way. It simply stood there, a silent and eerie presence. The dispatcher answered, and Jake stammered out his location and the bizarre situation he was in. The dispatcher promised to send someone out right away, but as Jake hung up, he couldn't take his eyes off the ghostly figure. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for help to arrive. The ghost didn't move, didn't vanish, and didn't seem to pose any harm. Instead, it seemed to be a specter of the past, a lingering presence in this cursed rest stop. When the police finally arrived, the white ghost simply faded away, leaving Jake alone in his truck. The officers searched the area, but found no trace of the apparition or any signs of foul play. As the sun began to rise over the desert, Jake realized that he had survived the encounter with the white ghost of Rest Stop 66. The desert night was quiet, the sky painted with a million twinkling stars, as John Baker, a rugged truck driver with years of experience behind the wheel, guided his massive rig down a lonely stretch of highway. He was on a long haul, transporting goods from one end of the country to another. The hum of the engine was his constant companion, lulling him into a state of deep focus. As John approached a small gas station at the edge of a desolate town, he noticed a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours." It was a rare oasis of light in the darkness, and the sight of the gas pumps sent a wave of relief through him. His fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and he was in desperate need of a break. Pulling into the dimly lit gas station, John parked his truck beside the pumps and turned off the engine. He climbed down from the cab, his stiff muscles protesting as he stretched. The air was dry and still, carrying with it the scent of gasoline and the distant howling of the wind. Inside the small convenience store, John found a lone cashier behind the counter, her eyes heavy with weariness. She gave him a tired smile as he entered. "Long night on the road?" she asked, as John approached the counter. John nodded. "Yeah, it's been a haul. Need to fill up and grab some coffee if you've got it." The cashier nodded and began to ring up the fuel purchase on the ancient cash register. John took a moment to browse the shelves, grabbing a couple of energy drinks and a bag of chips. He figured they would keep him awake for the next leg of the journey. Just as John was about to head back to the counter, the bell above the door jingled, and a man burst into the store. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face concealed by a ski mask. In his gloved hand, he held a gleaming silver pistol. "Nobody move," the robber shouted, his voice trembling with nervous energy. The cashier let out a gasp of terror, and John's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. The robber pointed the gun directly at the cashier, demanding she empty the cash register into a bag. With trembling hands, she complied, her eyes welling up with tears. John's instincts kicked in. He knew he had to do something to help. Slowly, he reached for his phone in his pocket, hoping to discreetly dial 911. But before he could make a move, the robber turned toward him. "Don't even think about it," the masked man warned, his voice cold and threatening. He waved the gun in John's direction, his eyes filled with a dangerous intensity. John's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly raised his hands in surrender. He knew he couldn't risk making a move with the gun pointed at him. "What do you want?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The robber hesitated for a moment, then lowered the gun slightly. "I need a ride," he said, his voice desperate. "My car broke down, and I need to get to the next town. You're gonna take me there, or things are gonna get real ugly." John weighed his options. On one hand, he could try to make a run for it or overpower the robber, but the gun was a dangerous variable, and he didn't want to risk getting shot. On the other hand, he could comply for now and hope for an opportunity to escape or get help later. "All right," John said, his voice resigned. "I'll take you to the next town. Just put the gun down, and we can talk about it." The robber seemed to consider John's offer for a moment before reluctantly tucking the gun back into his waistband. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He gestured for the robber to follow him to the truck. As they stepped outside, John couldn't help but notice the isolation of the gas station. It was miles from the nearest town, and the desert stretched out in all directions, its vastness swallowing them up in the darkness. He realized that he was in a perilous situation, and he needed to stay calm. John climbed into the driver's seat of the truck, and the robber followed suit, taking a seat beside him. The engine roared to life, and they pulled out of the gas station, leaving the terrified cashier behind. For the next few miles, the truck's cabin was filled with an oppressive silence. John's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. He knew he couldn't simply drive the robber to the next town and let him go. The man was armed and dangerous, and John needed to find a way to outsmart him. "Look," John began, his voice steady, "I'll take you to the next town, like I said, but I need to know your plan. Are you just going to disappear into the night once we get there?" The robber hesitated before answering. I don't know. I'm in a tight spot. Okay, I just needed a way out of here." John nodded, trying to keep the conversation going. "I get it. We all make mistakes. But if you're in trouble, maybe there's a better way to handle it than robbing a gas station and taking hostages." The robber's gaze shifted, and for a moment, John saw a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. "You don't know what it's like out here," he muttered. "I'm desperate." John decided to push a bit further. "What's your name?" The robber hesitated but finally answered, "Mark." "Okay, Mark," John said. "There's always a way to make things right. Let's talk about it. Maybe we can figure something out together." Mark seemed torn, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. But then, his resolve hardened again, and he pointed the gun at John. "Don't try to play games with me," Mark warned. "Just keep driving." As they continued down the dark desert highway, John knew he couldn't give up. He needed to find a way to disarm Mark and get help. He reached for his phone again, this time pretending to check the GPS on the screen. John nodded and handed the phone to Mark, who held it with one hand while keeping the gun trained on John with the other. As Mark began to fiddle with the phone, John seized the opportunity. With lightning speed, he reached for the truck's emergency brake and pulled it. The truck screeched to a halt, throwing Mark off balance. In the chaos, John lunged at him, wresting the gun from his grip. They struggled in the confined space of the truck's cabin, their grunts and shouts filling the air. Finally, with a powerful shove, John managed to knock the gun out of Mark's hand. It clattered to the floor, and John swiftly grabbed it, pointing it at Mark. "Get out," John ordered, his voice steady and commanding. "And don't even think about trying anything." Mark got out and John sped off. Jack Collins had been a truck driver for over 2 decades, navigating the winding roads and endless highways of America. He was used to the solitude of the open road, the hum of his truck's engine, and the ever-changing landscapes that passed by his window. On a moonlit night, as he drove down a desolate stretch of highway, he couldn't help but feel a sense of weariness creep over him. He longed for some company, something to break the monotony of the long haul. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the side of the road. Jack squinted at the silhouette, realizing it was a young woman. She held out her thumb, the universal gesture of a hitchhiker in need of a ride. Jack hesitated for a moment. He knew the dangers of picking up strangers, but the loneliness of the road got the best of him. Besides, the woman appeared harmless, her long hair flowing in the wind, and her posture radiating vulnerability. With a sigh, Jack pulled over and rolled down his window. "Need a lift?" The woman smiled, her face barely visible in the dim light. "Thank you so much." I've been waiting here for hours." As she climbed into the cab of the truck, Jack couldn't help but notice her beauty. Her eyes were a striking shade of blue, and her features were delicate and refined. She introduced herself as Sarah and explained that she was heading to a nearby town. The conversation flowed easily as they drove through the night. Sarah had a captivating presence, and Jack found himself drawn to her stories and laughter. It had been a long time since he'd had such an engaging conversation, and it made the miles disappear beneath the wheels. As they approached a desolate stretch of highway, Jack noticed a peculiar change in Sarah's demeanor. Her laughter began to sound hollow, and her eyes, once bright with life, took on a vacant, distant look. An eerie feeling settled in the pit of Jack's stomach, but he tried to dismiss it as fatigue playing tricks on his mind. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at her. Sarah didn't respond for a moment, and Jack's unease grew. Then, slowly, she turned her head to face him. In the dim light of the cab, her face had transformed into a grotesque, rotting visage. Her skin was pallid and mottled, her eyes empty sockets, and her lips curled into a sinister grin that revealed decaying teeth. Jack recoiled in horror, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. What the hell? The putrid stench of decay filled the cab, and Jack's heart raced as he struggled to maintain control of the truck. He swerved to the side of the road, slamming on the brakes, and brought the truck to a screeching halt. As the truck came to a stop, Jack turned to look at Sarah, but she had vanished. The cab was empty, and the putrid odor lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the eerie encounter. Shaken and bewildered, Jack stepped out of the truck, scanning the desolate highway. There was no sign of Sarah anywhere. It was as if she had never been there at all. Trembling, Jack climbed back into the cab, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He checked the time on the dashboard clock, realizing that only a few minutes had passed since he had picked up the hitchhiker. It felt like hours. Unable to explain what had just occurred, Jack continued his journey, the memory of the haunting encounter with the hitchhiker girl etched into his mind. He tried to convince himself that it had been a trick of exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by the weariness of the road. Hours turned into days as Jack pushed onward, haunted by the image of the decaying face and the inexplicable disappearance of the mysterious hitchhiker. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered something otherworldly, something beyond his comprehension. One evening, as he parked his truck at a remote truck stop, Jack found himself deep in thought. He had confided in a fellow truck driver about the strange encounter, but the man had dismissed it as a tired driver's hallucination. Jack, however, couldn't let it go. As he stepped out of the cab and headed into the truck stop diner, he overheard a group of truckers at a nearby table discussing local legends and ghost stories. One of them mentioned a tale about a hitchhiker ghost that haunted the very highway where Jack had picked up the mysterious girl. Intrigued, Jack joined the conversation and listened as the truckers recounted their own eerie encounters with the hitchhiker ghost. According to the legends, she was said to be the spirit of a young woman who had died tragically on that desolate highway, seeking a ride to the afterlife. As the stories unfolded, Jack's heart sank. It seemed that he had unwittingly picked up a hitchhiking ghost, and the horrifying transformation he had witnessed was a manifestation of her true otherworldly form. Determined to find answers, Jack decided to revisit the spot where he had encountered the hitchhiker. He drove back to the same stretch of highway, his truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. He parked by the side of the road and waited, his heart heavy with anticipation. Minutes turned into hours, and Jack began to lose hope. Just as he was about to give up and drive away, he heard a soft, ethereal voice calling his name. He turned to see the ghostly figure of the hitchhiker girl standing beside the truck. Her appearance had reverted to the beautiful, living form he had first encountered. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke, her voice filled with longing. "Thank you for stopping," she whispered. "I've been trapped here, unable to move on. But now, because of your kindness, I can finally find peace." Jack felt a mix of fear and compassion as he looked at the ghostly figure before him. He understood that this hitchhiker spirit was no malevolent entity, but a lost soul seeking solace. With a heavy heart, Jack nodded. "You're welcome. Go in peace." As the words left his lips, the hitchhiker's form began to glow with a soft, radiant light. She smiled at Jack one last time before gradually fading away, leaving nothing but a sense of serenity in her wake. Jack watched in awe as the highway, once haunted by the hitchhiker's spirit, returned to its desolate, quiet state. He knew that he had played a part in helping a lost soul find its way to the afterlife, and it was a haunting encounter he would never forget. With a newfound sense of wonder and respect for the mysteries of the road, Jack continued his journey as a truck driver, forever carrying the memory of the haunting hitchhiker with him, a reminder that sometimes the most scary encounters can lead to moments of profound understanding and compassion.
Until next time, take care.